In the early 1960s, rock and roll had become a mainstream success, and many of the hitmakers were coming out of the big East Coast cities with the help of tastemakers like Dick Clark and his American Bandstand. The oversaturation of the market, with similar sounding rock music, which was cleaned up to meet the moral demands of parents, started to seem boring to many teens. For many, a refreshing sound started to come out of the West with the rise of surf music. Surf rock seemed to reflect the youthful energy and some of the wildness that was missing in rock and roll at the time. One of the significant producers whose aesthetic influenced the California sound was Phil Spector. Spector had hit records as a songwriter and producer already by the time he was a teenager. Many other rock and roll producers were much older, so Phil Spector's youth made him more representative of the music he was producing. Artists like Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys and the Beatles were inspired by Spector's mastery of the studio, and they aspired to take Spector's approach further by making the studio an instrument for their creative imaginations. This video explains how Spector tended to work in the studio to create his signature wall of sound. The main idea was not to capture exactly what the artists were doing, but to create something new with the studio. Before we look at surf rock, let's briefly explain the rise of surf culture in California. Surfing was introduced to California in the beginning of the 20th century. It had developed as the activity of the ruling class in Hawaiian society. The chief in a Hawaiian tribe would be the best surfer and have the best board. Certain surfing beaches belonged to the elite. Surfing skills showed a deep connection to the ocean that was supposedly reflected in the chief's leadership abilities as well. There were a few surfing groups along the California coast in the first decades of the 20th century, but surfing gained huge popularity after the 1959 film Gidget. The movie depicts a young girl who happens upon a group of outcasts who don't want to work in regular jobs like their parents. They just want to surf. Gidget is an outsider herself and is intrigued by this wild bunch. In 1961, Life magazine declared surfing a new teenage craze. The insider culture of surfing might have been appealing to many teens looking for a style to define themselves. Like in any insider group, knowing the slang was a sure sign you belonged. Here's a comic showing the dynamic of surfing and teen culture. In the foreground are two non-surfers looking on as Dave carries a beautiful woman on his shoulders. It's understood that Dave's luck with the ladies came about because he learned to surf. Rock and roll was a good fit for the surfing lifestyle. Two innovators of the surf rock sound were Dick Dale and Leo Fender. Together they created the wet reverb sound of the Fender guitar and amp that became the foundation for surf rock. Dick Dale wanted his music to capture the feeling he got while he was surfing. In order to do that, he teamed up with guitar technician Leo Fender. There were many surf rock groups, but none became as popular or influential as the Beach Boys. The band formed in Hawthorne, California in 1961. They were mostly a family band, though they wrote hit songs about surfing. Only one of the band members actually surfed, Dennis Wilson. The Beach Boys' sound was basically a combination of surf music, the hot rod rock and roll of Chuck Berry, and the Phil Spector sound. The band's harmonies were clearly influenced by the Four Freshmen, and as Wilson continued to expand his songwriting, it was clear he admired many of the Tin Pan Alley standards as well. Here are just a few of the hits of the early 1960s that put the Beach Boys on the pop music map. Brian Wilson became bored with the simple songs of the early 60s and grew tired and anxious from touring. He began to retreat to the studio where he could work on his rock symphonies. The Beach Boys were one of the few bands in America that could compete with the popularity of the Beatles and other British invasion bands in the mid-60s. And so a friendly rivalry developed between Brian Wilson and the Beatles to be the most innovative in the studio. Brian Wilson's response to the Beatles' Revolver album was Pet Sounds, and it is one of the greatest albums ever made. Brian Wilson's idea for the album was that pop music could be as sonically rich and varied as a classical symphony, a radical idea at the time, since pop music was considered something simple that teenagers listened to for a few months until the next big thing came around. Brian Wilson gathered a collection of sounds, barking dogs, Coca-Cola cans, whistles, bells, a range of percussion instruments. The album was indeed Wilson's pet sounds that he wove into a richly rewarding listening experience. One of the greatest songs Brian Wilson ever recorded was Good Vibrations. It captured the idea of the rock symphony in one song. The recording is fascinating because it was done in several studios and then spliced together. You can actually hear the changes from one studio to the next if you listen carefully. You will also hear the eerie sound of the theremin, an electronic instrument that produces pitches based on the proximity of your hand to the center of the device. The song exhibits Brian Wilson's essential goal of transforming people's lives with soundscapes of good feeling. Good Vibrations takes the romance between a boy and girl and elevates it to a religious experience.